So we'll begin tonight with our acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gunditj Mara people, which are the traditional owners of the land in which Deakin University Warrnambool resides. We pay our respects to the local people and their elders, past, present, and future. We're scattered all around Victoria for this talk. So I do encourage you all to take a moment to consider the elders of the land that you are on and to give them your own acknowledgement. Fantastic. So we're now going to move on to our science team. I'll start with an introduction of myself and then I will bounce around the group. I apologize. I think I know everyone that's here. If I throw to someone and they don't respond, we'll just move on. So for those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Blake Allen. I am the Citizen Science Coordinator for the Victorian Coastal Monitoring Program, and I'll be emceeing tonight. I think I've probably met most of you at some point, or you've had an email from me. Most of you will have also met Kimberly, who I can see is on and drinking her tea. So quick hello, Kimberly. Would you like to say anything?
No, just hi, everyone. So.
Fantastic. And if Jesse is on at the moment, if Jesse would like to give a shout out, he's more than welcome. Nope, Jesse's not on. That's okay. I'll throw over next to David Kennedy from University of Melbourne.
Hello, everyone. Great to see so many faces there. I just feel really guilty. I haven't yet meet anyone in person, but yes, so you would have probably got a few emails from me and things like that, but very much welcome to hopefully a good evening as we do citizen science on Zoom. Welcome.
Thank you, Dave. And the next from our science team is Daniel Iridiakonu from Deakin University.
Hello, everyone. I co-lead the program with David Kennedy, and I manage a lot of the offshore work. So mapping the sediment compartments with sonar, establishing the wave buoy network so we can understand those drivers of what's actually happening on our coast. Thanks to the great work of all of you. So thank you so much for your support of the program.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. And next up from our science team is Jack McCarroll, and he's from DELP.
Thanks, Blake. And thank you all for being here. It's a really good turnout. Very, very pleased to see so many people. Yes, I'm with DELP. I'm a coastal processes scientist and used to be in research. And so now I serve the function in DELP of trying to get all the great research that comes from the project and from you guys to be used by people in government for making management and planning decisions on the coast.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jack. And if Raf's here, if you'd like to give a shout out, Raf, I'm not sure if you've made it quite on yet. Nope, we don't have Raf yet. That's right. Sorry, I can't see everyone because we've got quite a few. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have our two PhD candidates, and they'll be giving quick talks tonight. The first we have is Nick Pacino. Nick.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick, PhD student at Deakin, and I'm using the data that you are kindly providing us with your super great effort a lot every day. And thank you very much for the opportunity you've given us and me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. And then we have Dean Tobin from the University of Melbourne.
Probably a bit academic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dean. I'm sure I've met some of you before, but for those who I have yet to, I'm from the University of Melbourne. And thanks for all the great data that you've been investing in and helping us with. But I look at boundary conditions and sediments and geology and bits and pieces, but I'll go over a bit of that later on tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dean. So that is the VCMP science team that are here tonight. We'll all be answering your questions when you have them in our question times. But tonight's layout is we're going to start this online forum. It's jam-packed and it's loosely broken into two parts. The first part, we're going to do an overview of the VCMP, which will be done by Jack. Then I'll give everyone a run to date of the citizen science mapping program. Jack is going to talk a bit about changes to the VCMP in the upcoming months, and then we'll have some discussions. The second half is going to be some talks. So the first one will be from Jack about how he's using the data for Port Phillip Bay Nourishment Program. Then we're going to have Nick giving a talk about what he's been doing with his PhD, and then moving across to Dean to talk about his, and then breaking for questions again. We've got questions scheduled after each section instead of after each speaker, because we really work as a team on this program. And sometimes the speaker may not be the best person to actually answer the question that you have. So if you do have questions as we go, we're more than happy to answer them, but just please wait for those question times, and we'll do the raise your hand, which we'll tell you about how to do if you haven't done it before when we get to those sections. So to kick off the VCMP Community Group Forum, I'd like to throw to Dr. Jack McCarroll from DELP to provide us with an overview of the VCMP.
Right, so I wanted to give a quick background and focus in on some of the aspects of the program just very quickly that you might not be so familiar with. So let's begin by looking at some of these satellite images. I put these up because I find them fascinating and quite hypnotic. But the question up there is, why would we want to invest resources into monitoring the coastline? And coastlines are amongst the most dynamic places on the planet. And what you can see here are 4 of the most dynamic places along the Victorian coast. So you can see these things called flying spits here forming new parts of Swan Island. There's another flying spit here at Altona near a new monitoring site we're about to set up. And here the very active inlet around Inverloch, another area that we're monitoring. And here at Rosebud, I thought this was interesting. It looks like the sandbars near shore are moving in one direction with the waves, and the sandbars offshore are moving another direction with the currents from the tides. All right, and so the answer is quite obvious. Why do we need to monitor coasts? It's to understand how coasts have changed in the past, so we can understand the processes controlling the coast in the present, and use this to predict how shorelines are going to respond in future. But prior to just a few years ago, Victoria had no long-term coastal monitoring program set up. And so it was with the establishment of the VCMP that there was the initial first coastal monitoring in Victoria as a partnership between governments, so between DELP and the universities, Deakin and University of Melbourne and others. And as you all know, the citizen science drone program is a key element and really a world first, and everyone that's part of it. And I came into this quite late, and I saw what an impressive setup this is. I think everybody involved with it should be really proud of what's been achieved. But Blake will talk more about that in a second, and I'm just going to spend just a couple of minutes now talking about other aspects of the VCMP. All right, so the first aspect of the wave buoys, and as Dan mentioned, he's involved in a lot of the offshore work. And there's now a network of wave buoys that have been set up along the open coast, as well as some more recent ones within Port Phillip Bay. There's a website here, Vic Waves, where you can access all the data live, and there's been over 60,000 hits to that website since it was set up several months ago. And just like there's a lack of in Victoria of observations of the beaches, there has been a lack of observations with wave buoys. So these are really important from that sense as well. In addition, as Dan mentioned, doing bathymetry surveys. I love this image here. I don't know how it was generated, but you can see underneath the surface here, there is this 3D morphology being generated by the boat as it moves into open water out here. And also very important to the project and to understanding our coastlines of sediment sampling. And Raf Carvalho has led a lot of the sediment sampling, as well as work that Dave Kennedy's done across Victoria. Aerial imagery and satellite imagery are critical to complementing the drone imagery. You can imagine that we can only go back to 2018 and start collecting drone images. So if we want to go back before that, we need other sources. So aerial and more so now satellite imagery are really important data sources. So you can see, again, some of Raf Carvalho's work, some comparisons here between old aerial imagery turned into 3D and recent drone imagery, old maps here, and some aerial imagery at Port Fairy. And then the final critical part of the program that is necessary for predicting what's going to happen in future is numerical modeling. So what you can see here are models, a large-scale model of waves, the entire state, as well as there are models, hydrodynamic models involving currents, and then more finer scale models of shoreline change at different sections across the bay, across the state. All right, if you want to find out more, and if you're not already familiar, there is a really great website, the VCMP story maps. There's a link down the bottom there, or you can just Google VCMP story maps, and that will give you a really detailed rundown and really graphical information on all the different aspects of the project overview. Thanks, Blake.
No worries. So thank you very much, Jack, for that quick overview of the program in general. As I said from the program, the next thing that I'm going to do is give you a bit of a history of what's been happening in the VCMP citizen science area. So most of you have probably heard from me before. As I said, I am Blake Allen. I am the coordinator for the citizen science aspect, the coastal monitoring with the drones. And what I thought I would do for my part of this talk is really talk about how our program has evolved over time from where it started to where it is now, and where the program is at this point. So our program started in 2017, and it was part of the Sustainability Project Fund. And at that time, we had it titled Improving Coastal Erosion Assessments in Victoria. Now, in that funding bid that we put in, we said these few lines, which became the VCMP Citizen Science Program. We said a citizen science program will be developed to monitor shoreline change, integrating the latest advances in UAV-based mapping techniques, cloud-based processing, and data dissemination to increase opportunities for temporal data capture. Sounded fantastic when we wrote it down, sounded very fancy, and it was about 25% of that funding proposal. So from there, we were successful in our funding bid, and then we had to go about designing a world first program, which was training community members to fly drones. So the first thing that we needed to do was decide where we were going to try to capture data. In our funding bid, we had 8 sites. Many of you may laugh at that if you know how many we're running now, but our original bid had 8 sites. And they were 8 sites that were selected as priority locations for coastal erosion. And for the purposes of the citizen science mapping, they had to be outside of Parks Victoria land. So here is the coastline of Victoria. And we decided on our 8 general areas, which were one around the Portland Discovery Bay area, including potentially Bridgewater. Then we had one at Port Fairy, one at Apollo Bay, one at Anglesea, one at Ocean Grove, then Cowes, Inverloch, and Seaspray. This was our original plan, picking up on some very priority locations for coastal erosion on Victoria's coastline. Once we had these, we had to get down to the real crux of it, which was how do you train community members to fly drones? And at this point, I have to do an amazing thank you to the Port Fairy Coastal Group, who put their hands up and said, you know what? We're happy to be your guinea pigs. And I will thank them eternally for that and the way that they embraced our program. The reason that we went with the Port Fairy Coastal Group to trial it was that they were a well-established group that were already doing amazing science, doing transect lines, measuring the beach at Port Fairy. And because they were nearby to where we're based in Warrnambool, it was very easy for us to meet up with them and go through with them what needed to be done and work out what did work and what didn't work. We then took all this information and we designed a training program, which many of you have now been part of. We have the theory training, which is a series of videos which you can watch and learn what to do. And then we have the practical training on the ground where we take you through how to safely set up a drone, how to fly, and how to conduct really good survey grade mapping as citizen scientists. We developed our training manuals. One of these you get, which has the terrible name of Standard Survey and Operational Procedures for UAV Mapping Coastal Erosion. And the second one is one that we use internally to make sure that we provide consistent training to everyone. The other big aspect for us in this project was that we wanted everything that was collected to be available to the community instead of scientists having the data and being able to use it internally, but not really making it available to everyone. So we teamed up with Propeller Aero, who were an amazing local Australian company, and they came up with the portal that we could use, as well as the Aero points, which allow us to collect the centimetre accurate data to make these time series maps possible. So that was where we started. And then we officially launched, even though we'd started working with Port Fairy already. The official launch was April 11th, 2018 with Minister D'Ambrosio. And we did that in Frankston. We're all looking younger, happier, and my polo is certainly less faded back then. So we did the launch and everything went well. We showed off the equipment, we showed off how the mapping works, and we started to get into it, mapping in some of those first locations. However, quickly the program expanded. In June 2018, only a few months after we started, we added 2 additional sites in Port Phillip Bay. They were here at St Leonard's and at Mount Martha. Then, because we got a little bit sneaky, we also added one in Port Arlington because the group were very, very keen, and that's the Bellarine Bayside group. We then had a second expansion in November of 2018, which added Warrnambool to the group and was great about funding secondary sites for some of our community groups to be mapping. And this is why some of our community groups have been able to map 2 sites instead of just the main one near them. So in the beginning of 2020, we had all 15 sites being mapped by citizen scientists. We had 2 sites that were being mapped by the science team, and we had all 11 of our groups fully independent and mapping on their own. It was fantastic. And at this time, we had collected hundreds of data sets and it was looking great. And then fortunately, COVID hit. And as you know, that has had some fairly big impacts on our program. However, we were in 2020 fortunate enough to receive the Australian Museum Eureka Prize, and we won the award for science engagement, and that was for the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resource Eureka Prize for Innovation and Citizen Science. So this was directly for the citizen science aspect that you've all made such a successful program within the VCMP. So that was our big news for last year, which was fairly quiet otherwise. Moving on from that, we then had a third expansion in December of 2020, which brought more sites to Port Phillip Bay in. So we added one in Sandringham. We've got one in Patterson River, one in Dramana Macrae, and one in Blairgowrie. And the important thing that this also did was extend the current VCMP program into 2021. So just within the Bay, these are the sites that you can see just on this map that are all now being mapped by the VCMP Citizen Science Program. The final step to all of this was just recently, where we have a Port Phillip Bay Fund that has added Altona that we were really hoping to get going in August 2021. But for anyone watching the news, this area is a little bit of a COVID hotspot at the moment, and we're planning to get there as soon as possible. So that's our program, and this is where we are now. So we now have 22 locations along the Victorian coastline being mapped. And as of middle of August, we had 380 data sets which had been collected, which is just an amazing effort from all of our community members. And I would like to thank our community partners at this point. If I've missed your logo, I'm very sorry, but this is our list of community partners to date. So that is my talk. I will stop sharing there. Hopefully that's all brought you up to date with a bit of the evolution of the Victorian Coastal Monitoring Program and the citizen science collection that you're all part of. And I'd now like to hand back over to Jack to talk a bit about where the program is going now.
Thanks, Blake. There are some changes coming to the program over the coming months, and there's really nothing too dramatic. And I don't think anything coming up is going to be as dramatic as everything that we're going through at the moment with COVID. And you know, for many of us, it's not, being able to not get out and do a survey down at the beach, that may be a major thing that we're all missing. I certainly miss, being able to get to the beach like I used to. It's still possible in some ways, but that is undeniably the biggest impact on all our lives at the moment in so many ways. So that's that first point. That's been a challenge for all of us, but there are also some other factors as well, in that we're now dealing with aging equipment, technical issues with some of the error points failing as well. And there's these issues we've had the newer drones, some of you may know are RTK drones, and then the older non-RTK drones. And it's tricky to process the data with the old drones. There's more effort involved. It's easier to do it automatically on propeller with those newer RTK drones. Another issue is government funding cycles, and also university funding is more difficult these days in another COVID impact. And as Blake mentioned, there's various parts of the program that are ending, other parts of the program that are still going for another year. But what we're trying to do at the moment, I'll go into a little bit more detail, is get what's called a lapsing program to be refunded. But we're not certain where that's going at the moment. Obviously, we really hope the program's going to continue. So there may be some changes, but just to emphasise again that it's really core to this program is the success of these citizen science groups. So that is one thing that is going to stay in some way or another. So on to the changes from October. So that's only just a month away now. It's spring starts tomorrow. We're going to start conducting all surveys with the newer RTK drones, and all data will be auto-processed on the propeller platform. The science team pilots are going to, so that'll primarily be Blake and Jesse, maintain those RTK drones. Because there's a limited number, they'll transport them between the survey sites. And doing things this way solves a few of those problems, associated issues, in that the older non-RTK drones and the failing aero points can now be retired. The limited number of the newer drones can be managed by Blake and Jesse. If we're going to continue having lockdowns and restrictions on where we can go, which it certainly looks like we may be up until we hit 80% vaccinations or whatever it happens to be, who knows. The citizen groups may not be able to survey on their own, but the science teams can get there. And the citizen groups, you guys can all get down and still conduct surveys when there is permission to do so. And also there's this issue of, there's been so many disruptions to training and so on with COVID, that groups that currently have limited numbers or incomplete training are still going to be able to safely survey if Blake or Jesse or another science team member, Dean or somebody else is there. Also, we will have to slightly reduce the frequency of surveys, at least for this interim period. Up until the middle of next year, we'll be surveying every 2 months as opposed to every 6 weeks. And that is a factor of trying to cut costs to some degree. The programs, the lapsing program bid is going in at the end of this year, and we'll probably find out sometime early next year whether there's further funding. So a couple of things to think about or potentially to do over that period, if you're interested in supporting the VCMP further, is if you do get the opportunity, promote the VCMP in social media, or if something comes up through old school media, make sure you mention the importance of the VCMP and how critical it is to your community. And also, if you're willing, feel free to contact politicians at any level of government and voice your support for the program. As I said, we all hope that things will get better in many respects once things start opening up again next year, and we hope there's further funding from the program. The citizen science groups keep going, but for now, there's those probably what's in, fairly minor changes to the program up until the middle of next year. Thanks, Blake. That's the end for my second presentation, and I'll throw back to you.
Thanks very much there, Jack. So we're aware some of you may have some questions following that, or something more that you'd like to know about the program. Dan and Dave have very willingly put their hands up to look after the question time. So Dan and Dave, if I can hand over to you, and if anyone has any questions, please let us know.
Thanks, Blake. Sorry, Dave.
That's right.
So we're going to be monitoring the chat as well. So feel free to use your microphone, put your hand up, or write something in the chat.
I was going to thank Blake and Jack for a good talk there. I think one of the amazing things with the program is where it really is cutting edge. I actually grabbed the Eureka Prize, which I got mailed home since we couldn't do it in person. So thank you all. This is your prize very much as us. But I think the key thing has been it really is a world first of what we're doing. And some of the issues that Jack's talked about with equipment, I actually think is actually a positive thing in that space, that we're actually pushing the DJI drones to their limits of their capacity and the aero points too. So what we've got is combining this thing in really what they weren't designed to do. So the fact that we've got 3 years out of them, I think is just amazing, because we're running these in environments, the ocean. I mean, we know what that's like. We're running it in salty air. I mean, the companies are changing these things based on some of what we're doing from that. So I sort of feel like it shows all the hard work we're doing, that we're actually wearing the technology down. And I think it's that stage of then moving it forward with the new types of drones that are coming out, but really making sure we can keep this impetus going.
Yeah, and look, also, Wayne's got a question, but just before we start there, the beauty of this program is that you are all collecting survey-grade quality data. And Nick will talk a little bit about that later on, but it's as good as a traditional consultant would do using drone technology, and it provides an amazing time series for us to really work through and analyse that we'll cover later on. But for now, let's go over to Wayne. I think you've got a question.
Yeah, my question is, I'm in Kingston, Aspendale, and I raised this at the last meeting with Blake in April. And I know we're near an airport, but we have a massive erosion problem on the beach just east of the Mordialloc Creek. And I believe that this area does need to be monitored. I think I recall that Blake may have been a pilot himself, but we have plenty of drones going up in this area representing real estate agents. And I really don't see that it's not doable, and there is a real need just east of the Mordialloc Creek for something to be monitored.
Thanks, Wayne. Look, Blake is our Chief Remote Pilot at Deakin, and probably the best one to address that question. But it can be challenging when you're operating under CASA laws and trying to undertake a program like this. So over to Blake.
Thanks. So the reason that we picked where we're flying in that region, Wayne, which is at Patterson River, is because it's just outside the Moorabbin Aerodrome. We can't move more than about 1.5 kilometres north around the bay before we hit the circle that encompasses the aerodrome, which I think is where you're talking about, unfortunately. So we did have to be a little strategic with that location, and that's why we did pick there. The other thing is that we do have a limit of funds at the moment for new locations. We are always happy to expand the project if we can find the money. And this is where talking to your local representatives can really help. We are always happy, as you've hopefully seen from my talk, to add more groups, but we need to find the funds to do so.
I'll just jump in. I think in one space, as Blake said, it's interesting, as you said, Wayne, I've had the same frustration as you go down to sections of the coastline and you find drones appearing everywhere. I think in a lot of cases, there's actually a lot of illegal drone flying going on. And what we've been doing is really making sure that we are ticking every box that says possible. But I think, yeah, more spots, the better is my thing. But as Blake's, love to add more.
Just noticed we've got a question in from Ross Martin about how can we commence meaningful coastal hazard assessments using data generated by the citizen science program? That's a great question, Ross. And as you know, the whole reason why we're doing this is exactly for that. And I'm happy to report that there's probably not a consultant working in the Bay or on the open coast that is not integrating the data from the VCMP program. So we're already having a huge amount of impact there. And I could throw over to Jack. I don't know if you've got any more to say about that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'd say that's already happening, coastal hazards assessments. So I just got a request today for the St Leonard's. There's a renourishment going in at St Leonard's that's just about to start. It's part of that same, if you're from around the Bellarine, there was a renourishment up at Indented Head. There's a very small one at Rathles, and there's one going on further down now at St Leonard's. And we got a request from the consultant just today to get recent drone survey data for for their work that they're doing there as part of that assessment. I'm within DELP and using the VCMP data and using what's coming out of the researchers at both universities. We're using that data to do hazard assessments. I'll show an example one of Port Fairy in a second. And we're doing assessments all around Port Phillip Bay. The first stage is being conducted for assessments all around Port Phillip Bay for current nourishment sites, and using those assessments in order to determine when we're going to where future nourishments are going to be. So that's all happening now.
Thanks.
And just to add in that, I know there's for those of you in the Inverloch region, the Cape to Cape Resilience Project that's going on. It's our data that's underpinning that entire project, which I think WaterTech is the lead consultant on that. So it's definitely been going right in there.
And we've seen similar examples in Apollo Bay with the works happening there as well and elsewhere. I've just noticed we've got a question from Maddie Glynn here about how does the breeding cycles of species such as beach nesting birds or seals impact or alter the monitoring program? And this is a really good question, and I'll throw over to Blake, who's been having a lot of discussions with Birds Australia about this.
Yeah, look, Maddie, that's a great question, and it's a really important question. So the first one is that we don't work around whales. There's a whole other aspect to that. Drones are not allowed to be flown over whales. Please be aware that they do have a 500-metre buffer around them where you're not allowed to use drones. So don't go near those sorts of mammals. When it comes to birds, we have worked with BirdLife Australia to come up with a document to safely work around nesting birds. The first step is that we stay at least 75 metres above birds at all times. We find that this doesn't tend to scare the birds at all if they're nesting or on the ground. If we see birds being disturbed by the drones, we land immediately and we cease operations for that area for the day. And the third one is that we always take off at least, I'd have to check the document again, but I think it's at least 100 metres from any known or marked nesting site. And we do get in contact when possible with any of the bird groups in the area. So the great one is Port Fairy. There's two people there that are very keen on the hooded plover, and I always touch base with them when we've got mapping planned and go, hey, we're planning this one, and so that they know it's us and that we are being respectful. And they'll also let me know of any nesting areas that aren't marked out yet so that we can try to work around them.
Thanks, Blake. We've got a few questions also from Brian and Ian about costs of running citizen science groups. And this is it's a really good question as well. And what would it cost to extend or establish new groups? And look, it's a difficult question to answer because often it's depending on the scale of data that's coming in, because there's a few costs that we've got to take into consideration. We have the equipment costs. We also have the data hosting costs. So the more sites we have, often the cheaper package we can get in terms of data hosting. And then there's obviously the science team and the training and the continuation of the group. So Blake, I don't know if you want to say anything about the actual costs at the moment for setting up groups, but maybe that's something we can deal with later.
David Kennedy might have the best idea, because setting up the Altona group, Dave, I believe was part of that separate bid. Do you remember what that budget was?
It's roughly, I think within the figures we were doing, it ranges between, 40,000 is sort of a figure plus or minus a bit. It's sort of a good round figure, which does in that space, because there's the equipment itself, but as Dan was saying, it's also the process and that data hosting. So it's around about 40K per site, plus or minus probably about 10K, depending on how accessible things are.
Yeah, and also how long you plan to monitor for, and that comes into data hosting costs as well.
So just to answer Ian's question, the 40,000 is usually set up and a year to 2 years. Continuing years after that is significantly cheaper until the equipment needs replacing again.
Could I just add something to that? And I'm just going to share my screen for a second. And are you able to see the Digital Earth Australia site there?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, but I can't see it now. So there you can see, I think, Wayne, if you can say whether this is the area you were talking about, south of Mordialloc Creek.
Absolutely, you're right on it there.
Yeah,
and,
okay. So I just had a look at this. What I'm looking at, and sorry, I was switching my screens around there and got a bit lost for a second, is now we can always add more sites with the drones, but something we should be looking to do to be strategic and more effective at a broader scale over the longer term is integrate and improve our use of satellite extracted shorelines by calibrating them against the drone data. And over time, what we'd look to do is be able to more accurately, this is from Digital Earth Australia, from Zogro and Geoscience Australia, is use the shorelines that are being extracted there, work with them and improve the quality of those satellite extracted shorelines so that we can effectively get fairly high quality data going back to the mid 80s for any new given site, and have that working interactively with the drone data. So we won't just be limited to only looking at sites where we're doing drone surveys, because there is the cost that's there, and there's also additional analysis involved with every time we add a new drone site. So that's just another way of thinking about ways we can look at new sites.
Can I respond to you a little bit there? Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it, Wayne.
Yeah, with that photo that you just had up, the issue we have in the Mordialloc Creek, and I don't know if you can bring that last one up.
Try.
They dredge it regularly, and let's see if you can get it up. That's it, you're right in there. They dredge the Mordialloc Creek regularly and deposit it where you see the greatest build-up there, just out from the sailing club. And then it gets drawn back into the creek, and you can almost see that happening there in the second sandbank a little bit out further. And then they go through the process again. Now, Parks Victoria are about to extend the creek a bit with the hope of reducing that. But a little bit further down is the area that is eroding the most, where you are now with the cursor. That is a massive problem area where sandbags were put in about 12, 14 years ago. And that area is being very, very heavily eroded, whilst up the other end, closer to the creek, they keep depositing sand there. And the sand they deposit, each time they dredge it from the creek, it's getting finer and finer. If you look closely in those photos, you'll find the sand on the Mordialloc beach seldom changes. That's on the left of the pier. The sand on the right is getting finer and finer, and it blows through the air. It just gets ground down every time it gets dredged out and pumped through the pumps. It gets finer and finer. Dwelp are aware of it, and the shifting sands, Parks are aware of it. But there is an area just where the year date is, or a little bit further down the page, that has been eroding for 20 or 30 years and has got a strong history. And that's the area that I believe needs to be monitored.
Yeah, it's certainly worth looking into.
Sorry, Jack, can I just quickly jump in there from the
Yeah.
drone perspective? So the issue is, as you said, people might be flying drones, but this is called the Open Sky app that tells us where we can legally operate. And this big cross tells us that there is a controlled airport. And so we can't fly within the red. So you can see we come all the way out to down here, which is why we're working at Patterson River, which is lower here, because it's outside of this red zone. And for us, we are holding to the commercial excluded class for drone operations, which is what everyone's working under. And this is what's really limiting that area.
Yes. Just a final point, we better move on. Sorry, Blake.
Okay.
Is we are also, it's not just satellites. I also push for old school walking on the beach with a survey stick. You get still really good data from that. A lot of good survey programs around the world use that method. If we can't fly in places, that's sometimes an alternative. And while we're saying that as well, it's really important to get what's going on below the surface too. So I just want to say that drones are part of the program moving forward and a really key part. But there are other ways to get the data if we need it.
I think just to add on to that, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, the level of satellite analysis has been coming up just as the drone technology has been doing it. So we're really combining it. And as Dan put in the comments, Nick will be talking more about that, but the satellite's only 2D. The drones give us 3D. So it's fundamental linking between this. And it's a danger people often do is going, oh, just get all this off satellite. It doesn't get that storm event. It doesn't get that 3 dimensions. And that's the critical stuff we're getting here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. We've got another question there. Have we got time for one more question, timekeepers? Yep. There's one about the erosion hotspot at Inverloch, moving to the west of the surf club on PV land. How often will that section be able to be surveyed under the new arrangements? Look, the deal with PV land at this point in time is that you need certified pilots to fly the drones. So we have a number of those at the University of Melbourne and Deakin University. So the plan there would be that the science team would actually undertake those surveys because that's the requirement from Parks Victoria. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about that.
I would say that's actually going to be easier now that Jesse for your group, Philip, is a qualified pilot. So we're hoping that we can do that probably every 6 months, so every third flight. Once we're out of the PV land, I'm hoping to get the citizen scientists still on the sticks, but Jesse would have to fly that section. But it should be every 6 months is what we're going to aim for, I believe, Dan.
Thanks, Blake. And we've got a question from Rob as well. Is it possible for DUBs to inform groups where beach renourishment is going to occur? Little point if we are surveying after renourishment every time. Look, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think it's fantastic to actually undertake surveys when renourishment is being done because it provides a really useful way for us to monitor renourishment activities and the effectiveness of them. And we've been doing that at sites like Polo Bay. Anyone else, Jack? Anyone else want to say?
Yeah, I'm working on that at the moment. I'm just lost where the question was again. What was the... it's certainly very important to survey before, after, and then at staged periods after the nourishment goes in. I'll go into this a little bit more in the next talk I'm going to do. If we want to understand how these nourishments are behaving in Port Phillip Bay, that's a really critical part of understanding the dynamics, is monitoring as they go in and seeing how long they last, and being able to understand what the controlling processes are. And what we're doing right now is trying to work between myself, the other people within DELP who organise where the nourishments are going in, and with the surveying teams to make sure that we get those surveys before, after, and then follow up as well.
Thanks, Jack. Scott McFarlane has got a very important question there regarding rock seawalls being installed and local government supporting these methods of erosion control as they're preferred. Each local seawall is showing significant erosion at the base and to the leeward end, including loss of private property and increased personal injury incidences. Apart from lobbying, sorry, there's more questions coming through. I've just lost it. Apart from lobbying our council to look at science-based solutions, how can we address this? Has the VCMP data yet achieved a level where a more direct, possibly aggressive approach can be taken with the data that we have to date. Look, I'm not sure I really understand that question, but obviously when we're coming to managing the coast and intervention, there's a range of ways that we can go about that. Historically, hard solutions were the ones that people tended to draw to, but they may not necessarily be the right solution. And we're often talking more about soft solutions these days, and thinking about the potential and the need to potentially retreat in a changing climate, and what are the implications of those hard solutions moving forward. So it's a really difficult question, but yes, absolutely, the data that we are collecting in terms of the wave energy, you can't design structures without understanding what's happening out there in terms of energy. It's very difficult to do this without understanding the coastal processes that all this data enables us to provide. So I'm not sure if anyone else from the group has anything to say. I'm sure Dave does.
It's a constant challenge, I think, on the coastline in there, that level of going of what are you protecting, and that's usually it's the property boundary, and a wall's put in there for property boundaries. So it's a constant source of frustration, I have to say, that we get into that space. And there's a lot of different solutions being pushed around by various consultants and people pushing various structures for commercial benefit, really. But in a lot of the areas, I mean, we're already built in the wrong spots, and that's the council's knee-jerk response. We either build a wall on the land or we build it in the ocean. It's still a wall. But we have seen with some of our data, definitely down in Apollo Bay, that there's more renourishment, I think, being done, and tracking that renourishment, which has really shown that our data's been quite good. And that actually showed in a few instances. It was mid last year, and I think Nick may even cover it. The sand was renourished and then disappeared. And people say, well, it failed. We actually could show through the data that actually the renourishment satisfied the demand from the storm, which I think at least stopped in some areas some bigger walls, although there's a groin being built in there right now. But I think it's a challenge, and I think that's for policy makers. There is that knee-jerk response in terms of we're protecting a built asset, and I think that's where the stuff. But we're in the stage now, and this is where I think Jack's been doing a lot of work on in terms of the renourishment programs that are going around, of using our data to maximise where it's happening. And that's the thing. I mean, there's no easy solution. You can build a wall on the dune. People are building walls in the ocean. Walls are walls. But I think our data is starting to push them into more working with the sediment dynamics. And I feel a bit positive there, although I'd like to remind myself to feel positive because, yeah, we seem to see walls everywhere.
Yeah, look, thanks, Dave. I was just saying, just in regards to that data and the usefulness of data, Ross Martin's got another question about mentioning that the Victorian coastal hazard assessments, the four that we've done, were prohibitively expensive. Can you make a comment on how using citizen science generated data will impact costs of coastal hazard assessments? Look, I think looking back at those coastal hazard assessments, there was other issues at play as well. There was actually the lack of data. That was a real problem. We've sustained a wave buoy network for the longest period of time in Victoria's history. Now we've got data that is incredibly important for coastal hazard assessment. We've got regular information on shoreline change that can inform those assessments at a resolution level that we just simply have never been able to have before. So I think when you combine those benefits, and it's really expensive to set up a wave buoy or one citizen science site, but when you've got a coordinated network, besides having the benefits of understanding the pulses of change that are occurring across that entire network that informs other sites, you really have that base data to really go in and be able to use directly into these coastal hazard assessments. Anyone else?
Sorry, I'll just stop there. Look, if ever any questions that are coming in, Dan and Dave, if you're happy to keep an eye on the comments, and we'll come back to them in the second question area, just to keep us on time for the talks in case our students do need to duck off and do other things. But thank you everyone for the lively debate. And I can see Scott McFarlane has already jumped on that website that Jack showed. So fantastic work there, moving quickly. So yes, please keep the questions coming in the chat, and Dan and Dave will put them together. So now I'd like to throw back to Jack, who is going to do the first presentation, showing you a bit more of how we've been using this data. So thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Blake. Just share this again. All right, yes. Sorry, this is the last time you'll hear from me. I wanted to talk a bit about how DELP is using the data that's coming out of the VCMP. And it's no surprise at all that these types of applications are what you guys are interested in. It's what a lot of the questions have been related to. So I'll give a little bit of insight on this. And also just up front say that, well, a couple of things. I've only been with DELP for a relatively short period. I'm one of just one or two coastal processes scientists within DELP. I'd like to see more there. The VCMP has only really just started. If you compare it to somewhere like in New South Wales, where I'm from, Narrabeen is a beach that's been monitored for over 40 years. It's sites like that you really get detailed data from. So I want to emphasise now going into this that we're just at the start, and this is a pathway I think Victoria needs to continue down monitoring their coast, so that as the sea levels start to come up and more extreme storms come in, there's a better chance to be able to predict what's happening. But anyway, I'll jump in from this perspective of government. So as already discussed, the VCMP is this collaboration between a number of universities and DELP. And DELP's role within that, and the way I see my role, is to standardise data for others to use and promote the VCMP data and make it accessible. So as Dan said, he thinks there's not a consultant across Victoria now that isn't using the VCMP data. I'd like to see that done more, and I'd like to see it done more easily and without any friction, so that when a consultant needs that data, it's there and available for them, say from an online portal. Also, I want to see that data used more and the insights from that data used more within DELP itself. So you have many different groups within DELP who are responsible for coastal management, for planning and policy well into the future, but they may not be experts themselves, might not be scientists or engineers. So I want to see the data coming from the research to be most accessible for those people who are designing policy and planning. So we put this into two broad buckets. So the data that's being used to impact on how our coastlines are being managed right now, and also how policy and planning is being developed for the future. So some examples of a few of those, and we've already talked about these, so I'll just do them quickly. Port Fairy, the members of the Port Fairy group might be here, and Blake said I wasn't aware that it was the initial prototype test group, and so the most experienced veterans. And so there's a lot of work that's been done there. I did a recent synthesis and some extra modelling, pulling together all the VCMP work and some great other modelling work that have been done to inform on, as many of you would know, the issues with the landfill sites there and how those landfill sites are going to be protected or remediated over coming years. So the work from the VCMP was delivered directly to the project manager of this project within DELP, and that's an ongoing conversation as more data comes in, and that will influence the way interventions are conducted at that site over the near and medium term. We've also mentioned some other sites, Apollo Bay, Inverloch, and I'll talk about the nourishments in Port Phillip Bay in a little bit more detail soon. I'll just mention in terms of long-term policy and planning, there's still a long way to go here in terms of the influence of the VCMP, but it's certainly happening. Here's a number of the names of these. DELP is a very large organisation. There's lots of different groups doing different things. Some of those groups are the Coastal Erosion Advice Project. I'm meeting with someone from that group tomorrow. There's Victoria's Resilient Coast, mapping out these adaptation pathways that Stan was talking about, and Dave, in terms of preferring soft solutions over hard solutions and potentially, manage realignment or whatever it happens to be, mapping that out and using the data to inform that. And there's also Victoria's Marine Spatial Planning Framework that we've been using data from the VCMP as well. Okay, so I'll go through the work I've been doing recently on the Port Phillip Bay nourishments or re-nourishments, as they're known in Victoria. The sites that are being nourished this year and into next year are Blairgowrie, Dromana Macrae, Sandringham, Half Moon Bay, Anderson's Reserve, and St Leonard's. So this is just some of the monitoring sites. I know that some of you guys there will be from some of the other groups that aren't covered here, but these are the ones that are being monitored sort of in this year. Just something before we move on, you see the colours here on the shoreline around the bay there from that site, Digital Earth Australia, that are just flashed up during the question time. Blue here are shorelines that are moving outward over time, they're prograding. And the red and yellow areas, they're erosion and the hotspots of erosion. Morty Alec might be in there somewhere. You can see that across the bay as a whole, the shorelines are actually accreting. That's probably big news in itself. It's not that surprising. You see this in different coastlines around the place. We've got about 15 centimetres per year where these shorelines are prograding. It's only in the east and especially the northwest where you see erosion, the net trend for erosion there. So that's the bay wide as a whole. We're going to jump into the sites and just show a couple of examples here of the drone work and how this informs what's happening with the nourishments. Now, I said in response to one of the questions, it's really important to get a pre, a post, and then follow up and keep following up to understand how long these nourishments last. So this is at Anderson Reserve on the northeast of the Bellarine Peninsula. See, there's these two groins in here. This is pre-nourishment. The nourishment went in. You can see this nice big slab of sand that went in around December last year. And over that time, the winter transport direction is north to south. Seasonality is really important with the different wind and wave directions within the bay. Then the nourishment goes in. And then you can see the summer transport direction. So this is now from May after the end of summer is towards the north. And you can see this bulge in sediment here. And looking at the numbers here, this particular nourishment has not lost any volume within this general region in the few months since the nourishment. However, when the next survey gets done, we would expect to see some loss of volume. And I'll explain why now. Now, I think I heard Dave violated this rule. The first rule of nourishment or sediment budgets in general is sand doesn't just disappear. It always goes somewhere. And the job is trying to figure out. Now, you didn't really say that, Dave. You were quoting someone else. It's always going somewhere. And our job as a scientist to figure out where that sand is going. And something that happens with nourishments. So this is a profile view now. That might be the original profile. Nourishment goes in, call this a construction profile. It's very steep. But it's out of equilibrium with wave conditions. And so what happens really quickly is it tends to slump. Well, what's happening here is the top stuff from the top of the profile is moved offshore. That can happen really quickly when the first big storm comes in. And the advancement of the shoreline might be quite a bit less than where that original construction profile was. And that explains this thing of so much of the nourishment being lost so quickly after the first big storm. Really, it's something like this that's going on. There's a few other processes as well, but I'll just highlight this one. So just showing an example of that from here from Dromana Macrae. Here's a profile straight out of the textbook. This is the survey before the blues here, the profile before the nourishment went in. The yellow line is immediately after the nourishment, and the red line is just a few weeks later. And you can see we've gone out to number one and then back here with number two. And it very much follows that textbook example from the last slide. But it's nice to see that. But our job is to measure this and the other processes that are occurring for nourishments across the bay in order to understand and then be able to predict how long they might last, take into account over the longer term sea level rise and other effects, underlying shoreline trends, and then plan for how to more strategically place these nourishments and design the volumes knowing how long they're going to last. So just really quickly, I'll go through some summary synthesis analysis here of those various sites. And there's lots of colours here, traffic light colours, 3 different time periods here across the 5 sites. We've got red and orange for erosion, green and blue for accretion, and looking at 3 different time periods. And I'm really interested in looking at how the short, medium and long-term trends differ over time, because what a lot of coastal scientists are doing around the world right now is using 30 years of satellite data and assuming whatever trend they see from that, they can just extrapolate out to 2100. I've done that myself. But what we see when we look at the great aerial imagery going back to 1930 here, so that's these lines up here, the shoreline's just neutral here at Blairgowrie, whereas just in the last few years, and when we've got the drone data, there's a much stronger trend of erosion. So we can dig back in time, combine the data sources, and really understand what's happening in these shorelines in quite a sophisticated way by combining the data sets. Just looking at all those sites together and trying to summarize what's going on, looking at a long-term trend versus a short-term trend here. Just pick out a couple of examples. If we look at Sandringham in green, it plots up here at the top right, which it means over the short term and the long term, the site's been accreting. So it seems fairly healthy. We're still nourishing the site. There might be a reason for that. And then if we look at Blairgowrie, for example, this is the site as a whole, the broader area. It's steadily accreting, whereas there is quite severe recent erosion at the Blairgowrie site, just around where the nourishment's planned for. That's what we saw on that last slide. All right, without going into any of the detail, and this is still being worked on, we put that all into a matrix machine, a simple model that determines the erosion risk for each site, other factors such as beach amenity, which is really important in some places, habitat, research value, just finding out more about how these things work, and then still working on this. That'll help us determine where the next nourishment sites will be. Another really important role for DELP, as I said, is to make this data available for everyone. So there's already the Vic Waves and Propeller sites portals that we've talked about, but we're looking at getting all this aggregated data as well as the satellite and aerial imagery onto this portal here, CoastSat, CoastKit. And that is now going online. So that's live. You can look at some of the drone data and the trends over the different data sources for all those sites that I've mentioned. They're now available. It's a little bit clunky, but we'll get it looking better over time. And it's this data that we want the policymakers and the planners using within DELP, as well as the contractors, as well as future researchers using this data in a really easy, accessible way. And that's it from me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jack, and keeping to time well. So our next two presenters are our PhD candidates that have been working on the program. So we have Nick Pacino from Deakin University. He's about 3 years into his PhD now, and he was featured in the Meet the Researcher section of our April 2020 newsletter. So if people read that, you'll know a little bit about him. Don't worry, I'm sure he'll introduce himself if you haven't. And then we'll have Dean Tobin, who started his PhD a little bit more recently, but has nevertheless been involved in the VCMP for some time. And some of you may have met him during the training. So we'll start with Nick, and I'll hand over to you, Nick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Blake, for the introduction. Yes, I have been featured. If you don't remember, I reintroduced myself and still here, not moving away, even if I'm almost at the end of my third year. What I do in Deakin is basically using a lot. Actually, let's start my presentation so that it's easier for me to let you understand what I'm doing. Okay. So in my PhD objectives are basically looking at erosion, sediment dynamics, and sediment properties, beach properties at 3 different scale levels from the beach itself. So I look at the sediment properties of the grain size mainly of beach, because grain size is very important as all coastal processes, not all, but most of the coastal processes and dynamics that occur on the beach and the landform, how they evolve, they are heavily influenced by the grain size of the sand and the energy that comes in, of course. And I also work with satellites, like you mentioning a lot of satellites. And yes, I work with the Sentinel-2, which is an European satellite that flies over our heads every 4 to 6 days, roughly, and collects images at 10-meter resolution. But mainly, I'm focusing on the citizen science data. So your data that you guys are heroically providing us, and in this World First initiative. And what I do is basically 3 things with your data. One thing is computing erosion at the transect scale, like I will show you right now. Then at the image scale, at the full pixel size scale. And then I will also use your data to validate shoreline from the satellite, because a lot of people extract shorelines from the satellite because it's easy. But of course, that's very good. But on the other hand, it's how can you validate this data if not going there while the satellite is flying and with GPS marking the real shoreline, and then see what's the difference between the actual shoreline and what the satellite sees. That's impractical. But thanks to you, we have a lot of data sets that basically you went there flying the drones while the satellite was flying. So we have another word for it, huge validation data set for shorelines, and I'm very excited. But now I focus on the first year of research that I've done using the first year of citizen science data, of drone data. I'll skip over this because you know already how it works. Basically, you've been trained, you've been provided with the training data set, with the tools in your locations. We get data and we process it in 3D. In the first year, all the results that I'll be showing right now is only the first year. So I was focusing on finding a good way, cost-effective, time-effective, and especially computing effective to monitor all of the data sets that I had at that time, around 100 data sets in 10 locations, going from Port Ferry to Sea Spray. And of course, we could use image-to-image difference. So basically, the 3D model of today minus the 3D model of tomorrow, it gives us the difference at every pixel, but that's huge. You can do it on Propeller because it's quick, but if you want to do it for 100 data sets, it's going to take a lot of computation time and a lot of effort. And especially important, we have to distinguish between what is sand and what is not sand, because as you know, there are a lot of strange things on the beach that is not sand. So if you want to monitor sediment dynamics, you need to get sediment, not beach wrecks, macroalgae, people, or work, anything that it's not sand. So I had to find a way to do it good. And I decided to use transect, cross-shore transect, like these ones that you see on in the image. Actually, I'm gonna use, let's see if I can use a pointer. Yes, here. 1 second. There you go. And then I use machine learning to discriminate between what is not sand, like in this case, and what it is sand, like in this case. There are other things that I had to consider, a lot of parameters to consider, because the quality of the data is the most important thing that we need to take into consideration before doing any analysis. I wanted to know how accurate are your data sets using our protocol, so your protocol, and using the ground control points and everything that you know. And also, so this is the accuracy. And also, I really wanted to know if different locations, so different groups of people work differently. In other words, if we want to do a coherent regional scale analysis, we need to make sure that people in Port Ferry do the same errors or are as good as people in Sea Spray, so that all the results can be agglomerated into one coherent analysis, and that's called bias. I needed to make sure there were no bias. You were considered all one. After a lot of analysis, statistical analysis, independent data set check with RTK and different methods to validate this, we were very happy to see that you guys are just as good as the professional surveyors. Basically, there are different metrics that we can use, but the most used one is this one, root mean square error. And the error of this method is 9 centimeters in vertical accuracy, in the vertical dimension, in elevation. what we expect is to be precise at the 9 centimeters level, which is completely perfect and completely expected. In fact, I even compared with the literature to see basically who are the best ones. So the citizen scientists or the actual scientists like us. And I found out of 30 something papers, publications, in the same conditions, using drones the same way we do in beach environment, the same way we do all these things, you were just like 2 centimeters below the median accuracy reported by these super scientists, and which is amazing, because it means that you are just as good as us, as scientists. You are scientists. And then also, sorry, I forgot to tell, there was no bias. I also did the bias, no bias. So you can be coherently aggregated into one big army, doing the same job perfectly in all 20 today locations. I did this for 10. It must be done also for 20 to see if there are differences, but I don't think they will. And then we were able to, this is again only the first year, we were able to monitor the volumetric change in these 10 locations pretty comprehensively. As you can see, these are all the locations, and you can actually see from survey to survey. Every point is a survey along these locations, for example, for ferry. And the solid line represents the change from this survey to this survey, from this survey to this survey, and so on. So you can actually see this is the mean elevation change across the whole beach and across the whole transect. So it's one measure for the whole beach, which is okay if you want to compare at a regional level, but you know, we miss the spatial accuracy, the spatial distribution, but you'll see soon. Another very interesting thing is that we were able to, by looking at the dashed line here, this is the cumulative change from the start of monitoring in every location. Basically, after the first, let's keep on looking at Port Ferry. After the first erosional event, we could, by looking at when the cumulative change crosses the zero, which means basically it came back to its original elevation, mean elevation. Basically, we can quantify and estimate the recovery of a beach. And that's pretty amazing because we were able to do it for the all locations. And actually seeing that some locations, like for example, San Leonard or Apollo Bay, they never recovered quite well. Even though in Apollo Bay and Marengo, there was a nourishment project, and also Inverloch, we were able to see that Inverloch was very badly eroding at that time. So of course, we were also able to downscale the analysis and look at much more closely at the differences in along shore. So in this case, you can see this is Apollo Bay. And on the left-hand side, you can see the heat maps of elevation changes a little bit more at the transect level, so that we can appreciate the different zones of and how they behave. On the map on the right, you can see, for example, that I were able to model the dynamics of every single transect in a way to distinguish 3 different zones. And at the M zone, which is mixed, and it goes from the harbor to 200 meters along shore, and then a very erosive zone from 200 meters up to 800 meters from the harbor here, and then a more depositional zone. And these 3 zones were distinguished based on the dynamics of every single point along the transect, and in all the year, in every year. And the result of this spatial distribution was because of sand nourishment occurring in Apollo Bay. And it was, I think it is still focusing mostly on this part of the beach, where the Great Ocean Road is closer to the foredune, to what it remains of the foredune in here, and less focused on this area, because it was supposed to be more stable because it's sheltered from the swell from the harbor. However, even though this area D, the D zone here, the D area was heavily nourishment during this monitoring period, we were able to distinguish hotspots of erosion occurring here and here in A inset, which is due to a water outlet, and B here, as you can see, this is a very famous hotspot of erosion, and we were able to depict it. As you can see, there was a car park damaged by the erosion, and I think they fixed it now, but I'm not sure. And now I just put this now while you were speaking, because you were saying, yes, sand nourishment is important. We need to get to be able, I think David and also Jack mentioned, we need to be able to monitor before and after the sand nourishment, because we can actually, yes, we can see the difference and the impact of the nourishment. In this case, I rushed, so I copy and pasted, so it's not a perfect definition, but look at this. I checked the profile number 10 in here. This is Marengo Beach. And this area—
So Nick, 1 minute.
Oh my God, I have still a lot to tell you about. This was nourished a lot. As you can see, this big profile is 25th of September 2018. It's due to nourishment. So it's, sorry, the blue one is the 27th of July, and the red one is the 25th of September. So after, this is what was added as nourished. And what happened after the nourishment occurred? It went down, it got eroded. So this one, the blue this time, is what it was before. Basically, accreted, the nourished portion of the sand that was added. And what happened by the 13th of November, basically less than 2 months after, it got eroded, totally eroded. It went all over. It's gone. But like David was saying, imagine if the sand wasn't deposited there, what would have happened to the Visosha Road? And then another thing, I'll go very quick because I will go over time 100%. Look at the envelope. This was only the first year. And what happened after the first year? Actually, after the first year in envelope, it's important to note that the cumulative change is still negative, which means that from the start of the monitoring, envelope is still losing some sand, but it was slightly able to diminish the erosion rate. The blue one is the volumetric change from time to time. And up until the 13th of May 2020, we even saw 3 events of deposition. So the total volume change in envelope was positive, which is good.
I think we're going to have to cut you off there just to keep everyone on time. Okay.
It's, can I just show 2 images just to see, to let you know what I'm also doing here? Same thing, but at the pixel level. Using artificial intelligence. That's what we're gonna do. And some results, they're pretty encouraging. And okay, that's it, it's finished.
All right, thank you very much, Nick.
Sorry for this.
All right, and now on to our final presenter, which is Dean Tobin from the University of Melbourne. So thank you, Dean.
Hi, everyone. And then I'll start my talk. Hopefully it won't take too long, given you've all hung around till almost 7. So thanks for staying by to listen. So a little bit of background on me first. I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, funded by the VCMP. But I've also done my master's previously, looking at some of the seasonal change, looking at data that you guys collected using drones. And I'm interested in the sediment characteristics and the physical features of beaches that impact how beach movement is affected, particularly in Victoria, where my case studies are. So just a quick outline, shouldn't take too long, but I'm going to talk about a little bit of background on controls on beach sediment distribution with an example, talk about to what extent Victorian beaches are influenced by the geology of the region, and also some of the nature of the Victorian sediments, primarily in eastern Victoria. So first of all, here's a little bit of background. This is effectively a sideways representation, as we've seen before today, of a beach. So it's a beach profile. This is a classic example of how beach processes and responses occur. So in this case, it's talking about sea level rise, and what you get with that is an amount of erosion caused by that, the result of which is a redistribution of sediment down the slope of the profile, and that impacts, I guess, the morphology, the shape of the profile, the shapes of the beach. And we've sort of covered off little bits and pieces of that as we've gone today. Some of the work that I'm doing, though, is looking at how even though that's a case that we might expect in a free-moving environment where sediment is in excess and there's plenty to go around and move around in a profile, that's not always the case. So this slide is sort of a representation of geological control theory, and uses work done by Gallup et al. Last year. Sort of talks about how, while that's fine in a case where there's no geology involved, that actually that's probably not true in all cases across the world, but in my case, Victoria is what I'm looking at. So if we look at example A on the left, that's the free moving sediment. So if you have a sea level rise in that, then you can expect the sediment to redistribute as I described in the previous slide. However, example B, we see there's some resistant foundation with some bumps in it. And instead of being able to redistribute sediment down the profile, there's some interrupting hard structures that cause that. And of course, this isn't just a case of one bump or whatever, there's also a represented spectrum. So what I've been looking at is, well, what's actually the case in real world in Victoria? Is it a case that all sediment is free to move and disappear or up and down a profile in the cross shore? Or is there a lot of hard structures that might interrupt this free moving process? And here's a summary diagram of some work I've been doing using LiDAR collected by the VCMP across the entirety of Victoria. And effectively, it's a representation of how much hard structure and how much soft structure there is in the nearshore environment for beaches around Victoria. So effectively, each line represents an individual profile along Victoria, 2 kilometre spacing, with the amount of blue in a given line representing how much reef or rock there is in that profile, and yellow being how much of that transect is made up of sediment. And what we can see is, in the case of Victoria, there's quite a lot of rock involved. So the assumptions that we make in terms of free moving sediment might be somewhat limited in this case. And I'm just going to spit off some statistics to illustrate, I guess, that point. What I've got here is a line at the 50% marker for, so basically any blue line that goes above that represents a beach profile that is made up more of rock than of sand. And it turns out that across the entirety of Victoria, we can expect about a quarter of beaches to be made up of more rock than sand. And that's particularly true when we break it down looking at, say, different regions of the coastal Victoria. So east of Port Phillip Bay, which I don't know if my pointer's showing, but the top part, the top text shows where Port Phillip Bay is. If we look west of that, then it's actually quite a lot more rock than to the east. So 35% of profiles west of Port Phillip Bay contain more reef than sand. 17% of profiles west of Port Phillip Bay are actually more sand, more hard bottom than soft bottom. So over 90% rock for 17% of those profiles. But if we look to the east of Port Phillip Bay, 50% of profiles contain no rock in them whatsoever. So it's more nuanced than obviously a Victoria-wide statement. And this is particularly true around 90 Mile Beach, so where I've got it marked as sea spray and that sort of area where there's very little rock at all. And there's few embayments and headlands in that area. So in some ways it reflects that pattern of embaymentization and headlands that we see. So I think I also mentioned earlier that I'm interested in the sediment characteristics of Victoria. And so to complement work done by RAF, I think we touched on earlier, in terms of sediment sampling, I've collected 120 different samples from various sites along the east part of Victoria. And I'm currently looking at them in terms of the qualities of the sediment in that region. And so this is sort of a brief representation just quickly. I won't go into too much detail, but effectively what I want to show, I guess, is the variability of sites in terms of composition and sediment size. So if we look at the Mornington Peninsula, which is the furthest west region compartment, there's quite coarse sand. It's fairly well rounded. It's quite light and fluffy to walk on. It's got some silicates and stuff involved. But if we compare that to somewhere like Waratah Bay, which is to the west of Wilson's Prom, the big promontory in the bottom of the map, then we see some more sort of clayey, finer sediments. But also that's, I guess, combined with what we see as a lot of pebbles in the area. You can sort of see in the hinterland, in the sort of landward, that the land juts out a lot more and rises a lot steeper, as opposed to Mornington Peninsula, because that's made up of igneous rocks and extruding out of the landscape, as opposed to the dunes that we see, say, at 90 Mile Beach, which is again fairly fine sands, quite clayey. But yeah, with big sort of fine dunes built up around behind that. And that'll do for today. I've included my email at the bottom in case I haven't touched on something that you're interested in, but thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dean, and kept it to pretty much 7 p.m. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming. Dan, Dave, myself, and potentially some of the other science team are happy to hang around if people have questions, but we understand we said 7, so if you have to go, thank you very much for coming tonight. We hope you found it informative and interesting, and we'll open it back to questions chaired by Dan and Dave.
Thanks, Blake. I have been trying to keep up with the questions in the chat. It's been fantastic.
About to say, so have I. We've been doing a tag team.
But thank you so much. And apologies if we've missed anything, but is anyone that would like to ask a question whilst we keep trawling through the chat?
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with the talks as well as responding in the chat. But there's some great questions.
There is.
I think Lizzie had one down. Lizzie McKinnon asked one earlier. You may have answered it, but I thought it was an interesting question.
What was that? Is Lizzie still online?
I'm not sure. Sorry, it's such a long list. It was, why are some places given nourishment with dumped or dredged sand, but other shorelines are sandbagged, like Portsea Pier? I don't know if anyone in our group can answer that, but that's an interesting question.
I'll go jump in if no one else wants to go. They're different forms of intervention. And as Dan was talking about before, and Dave, we sometimes use the word soft and hard interventions, and, you know, or working with nature is another one that goes to soft interventions. Not all nourishments necessarily good for habitats. But in this instance, renourishments are a softer form of intervention. Extra sand added to the beach can be moved around by the natural processes, become part of that system. We expect fairly minimal long-term impact. What we'd hope, though, is that we've got more sand in the sediment budget and a wider beach overall. And sandbags are reasonably soft, but they're still getting towards a harder solution. They might have more of an impact. They recently have been used. What's the site that we're talking about here?
Portsea Pier.
Portsea Pier. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I was going to say sandbags have also recently been used at Wye River. And I was just commenting to Dan and Dave on this, that as opposed to something, an even harder solution like a solid seawall or a groin, those temporary sandbags seem to have done a reasonable job in that instance, and we hope they can be extracted fairly soon. I know Ollie Nixon's on here as well, and he's from Gorkapa, and he's been heavily involved with the work that's been done there at Wye River. And he's also working, Gorkapa's working closely for anyone that's interested, and they're doing some drone surveys that are going to be integrated into Propeller and become available on there like the other VCMP ones. But back to
Great Ocean Road Management Committee. That's Gorkapa, correct?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I'm from the government. I use acronyms. Sorry, I didn't even notice I did that. The sandbags are a medium hard soft intervention and can be quite effective in places, but generally the strategy that is best to go in with is do nothing if possible, then start softer, and if necessary go harder if there's a real need to protect infrastructure. And that's sort of these adaptation pathways that we're talking about, and those sandbags are something like medium hard, medium soft.
I think one thing, to be the academic, I can say in a lot of the spaces there is, I mean, one of the issues we've got is there's a lot of infrastructure on the current beach, on the current hazard zone. And a lot of the states just get into that area, what are we prioritising? But I think different interventions probably get down to a lot of different actual management organisations and available funding, and probably the urgency of a different area. And I think this is one thing our data's getting in there, because previously it was simply an erosion event, hits the front page of the paper, someone has to act to show they're doing it. But now we can actually say for these, all the sites are the key sites now, we can actually start saying, this is where the sand's going. If you decide you have to intervene, this is going to be the best way to maintain some sort of beach or move the sand. I mean, the biggest change, I mean, we are seeing sand moving around on the coast. On the open coast, it's the change in wave direction from climate change, which is going to see the biggest impacts. So what we can try and do is work with that sand movement. I like to think beaches are a dog's tail. They're constantly waving. We've got to sort of try and keep them more or less in the same spot.
Great analogy.
Thanks, Dave. Any more questions from those still online? No? Well, look, I'd like to hand over back to Blake, but on behalf of the VCMP team, thank you so much for your engaging discussions on the forums, and thank you for sitting in there for the long haul for our talks, and we look forward to working with you all in the very, very near future and continuing this amazing program and fantastic opportunity for us all.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to all of this science team that spoke today, and thank you all of our community members and people who came along. We really do value your input. And again, if you have any questions following up from this, vcmp@deakin.edu.au, feel free to drop us a line, but we'll end it there. So thank you very much.